Shalom. Once again, we are caught up in the drama, the saga, the eternity of the Torah. We finished the cycle of reading the Torah. Simchat Torah is behind us. And we finished the book of Deuteronomy, and immediately the same day we began the book of Breshit. Now we are already progressing in Sefer Breshit, in the book of Genesis, and we believe that there is a strong connection between the end of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah. Indeed, there is no beginning and there is no end, and time as well is cyclical, not linear. And we're in the middle somewhere, and the Torah continues, and we continue to find ourselves there in the Torah, the manifest program of Hashem's presence in this world. So how do we connect between the end of Devarim, Zot HaBracha, the portion wherein Moshe Rabbeinu takes his leave of the children of Israel and gives individual blessings to each one of the tribes, and then ascends to Hashem, as it were, and leaves the world? How do we connect between the end of the Torah and the beginning, Genesis? And there's all kinds of ideas, some of them seem whimsical, some of them quite beautiful. There's an idea that's very famous, that the last letter of the Torah and the first letter of the Torah in Breshit form the word Lev, heart, which is certainly what we need in order to study Torah, and the Torah is Hashem's hearts, and we need heart for this world. I think that that idea is massive, and we don't really appreciate it, the idea of how much our hearts are involved with the world, and how much the world also has a heart. And I think the connection between the end of the Torah, as it were, there doesn't have an ending, but the conclusion of Sefer Devarim, Deuteronomy, and the beginning of Breshit is much deeper than we realize, because actually I think there's a theme, there's a background of the whole Torah, and we sense it very strongly in the bridge between Deuteronomy and Genesis. And that is the basis of the whole world, is a sense of yearning, sense of a longing. And that yearning is a palpable, almost a physical drive. It's a cosmic power that literally keeps the world alive. In other words, I want to suggest to you now, as we seek to connect between the conclusion of the Torah in Deuteronomy and beginning it immediately again in Genesis, that the message that's being broadcast is a clue to understanding the secret of survival, both of humanity and the world as a whole, and that is the aspect of yearning. Someone once said, you can't always get what you want. And the fact is, our greatest motivation, and maybe the noblest moments of our own humanity, seem to be fired by the fact that we don't have what we want. And that place in us, filled with longing, that mystery, the thing that we feel that is missing from our lives, that we're striving for, that we're yearning for, that we're pining for, it's a place of pain. It's a place where we feel that we are not complete, that we're missing something. That is really what gives us the strength to go on. And this quality might even be, shall we say, elemental. It might be so basic that it might be forged into the very core of existence. Perhaps even, we could say, at the very heart of the world. And the Torah teaches us that whether we know it or not, whether we realize it or not, the thing that really fills us with the deepest longing and the source of the greatest pain and yearning is our desire for godliness, our desire to reconnect with God, because we were taken, our souls were taken, hewn, our sages tell us, from underneath the throne of glory. We want to reconnect with the source of all unity, to be united with Him, and also to bring His light into the world. And our greatest pain and sense of yearning, which is a positive thing, comes from the fact that we are not together, and David, forerunner of the Messiah, who brings this home and completes humanity, as it were, he tells us this in a very succinct way. It's very beautiful. In Psalm 63, a psalm by David, when he was in the wilderness of Judah, "O God, you are my God, I seek you. My soul thirsts for you, my flesh longs for you, in a parched and thirsty land with no water." And this idea of one's flesh pining for God and one's soul thirsting is the microcosmic expression of all humanity's desire to reunite with godliness. And this whole idea of this feeling of needing to reunite, of uniting ourselves with godliness, this is part of creation. And it's woven into the very fabric of creation. And there's a very beautiful example of this. We turn to the teachings of the great tzaddik and the great master Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who told stories. He told some very profound stories. They're called Rabbi Nachman stories, and they contain all the secrets of the universe. And he felt that in order to share the deepest secrets of the Torah with people that perhaps are not on the level to receive these things, but yet everyone needing to know these things on the deepest level of the soul, he couched great mysteries in stories and parables so that people would retell them and somehow by osmosis get these messages in their souls. So he told a story, and the story contains everything in the universe, and it's so complex we can't do it justice. It's called The Seven Beggars. It's divided into days, and there's an incident that's told over there in what's called the third day of that story of the seven beggars. And he says, and I'm just taking something out of a massive, sprawling tapestry. You have to look at the original. He says, there is a mountain, says Rabbi Nachman. On the mountain there is a stone. From the stone flows a spring. Everything has a heart. Therefore the world as a whole also has a heart. The heart of the world has a complete body, with face, hands, and feet. The mountain with the stone and the spring stands at one end of the world. The heart of the world stands at the opposite end of the world. The heart of the world faces the spring and constantly longs and yearns to come to the spring. It has a very, very great longing, and it cries out very much that it should be able to come to the spring. The spring also yearns for the heart. The heart has two things that make it weak. First, the sun pursues it and burns it, because it has such a desire, yearning to go and be close to the spring. The second thing that weakens the heart is the great longing and yearning that it constantly has towards the spring. It longs and yearns so much that its soul goes out and it cries out. It constantly stands facing the spring and cries out, help, desiring it so very much. And this is somehow at the basis of the world, Rabbi Nachman is telling us. When the heart wants to rest a bit and catch its breath, a great bird comes and spreads its wings over it, protecting it from the sun. It then can relax a bit. However, even when it is resting, it looks towards the spring and yearns for it. One may wonder, says Rabbi Nachman, since it yearns for it so much, why does it not go to the spring? However, if it were to come close to the mountain, then it would no longer see the peak. It then could not gaze at the spring. And if it stopped looking at the spring, it would die, since its main source of life is the spring. When it stands facing the mountain, it can see the peak upon which the spring is. But as soon as it comes close to the mountain, the peak is hidden from its eyes. This is clearly demonstrable. If it could not see the spring, then it would die. If the heart died, then the entire world would cease to exist. The heart is the life force of all things, and nothing can exist without a heart. It is for this reason that it cannot go to the spring, therefore stands facing it, yearning and crying out. And this somehow is a parable that relates to elemental forces of creation. There are two entities, this heart of the world and the spring, that yearn for each other, and they're facing opposite ends of the world. And they look to each other with such tremendous yearning. But as soon as they would start to move and lose the perspective, that would be the end. So it's yearning and desire that keeps the world going, according to this understanding, something woven into the fabric of creation. And yet, again, as we saw from Psalm 63, the Torah is all about yearning. It's all about our yearning to be with Hashem despite the limitations of the world. And maybe this is the meaning of something that we read about in Parashat Breshit, in Genesis, when it comes to the description of the very beginning of the creation of the world, and something that our sages tell us that's really amazing. We read in the very beginning of Genesis, we read about the act of creation of the second day. And we read that on the second day, God created, amongst other things, the firmament. We read in Genesis 1, verse 6, we read, God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate between water and water." So God made the firmament and separated between the waters which were beneath the firmament and the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. God called to the firmament heaven. So, in the very beginning, there was water, because the Spirit of Hashem hovered above the face of the deep. And then God separated between the upper waters and the lower waters through the firmaments. And our sages tell us something very extraordinary about this act. The Midrash tells us that when God created this firmament and separated between the waters, some being above and some being below, some being below, and again, these things are powerful analogies. These things are huge concepts that strike at the very core of our identity and existence. Because when our sages are teaching us secrets of creation, they're teaching us what makes the world tick, and they're teaching us what forces are part of our makeup as well. So the Midrash tells us that when God created the firmament and divided the water, arbitrarily there are waters that are above the firmament and waters that are below. Those waters which were above the firmament, says the Midrash, were joyous and elevated and were full of dance and song, and they declared, "How fortunate are we," declared the upper waters, "that we merited to be close to our Creator." Whereas the waters that were placed below the firmaments, the lower waters, as it were, the earthly waters, cried out in great agony, "Woe to us that we did not merit to be close to our Creator." And our sages continue and expound upon this idea in various ways. But perhaps this is, to some degree, the secret of the power of tears. And we can see very clearly that on the most basic level of creation, on the second day of creation, the yearning, the longing, the pathos of separation affects water, the most very basic element of creation, so that this secret of the struggle of the lower waters and the feeling of incompletion and the feeling of yearning and the feeling of being apart from the Creator is like a force that literally unites heaven and earth, that force of yearning. And we can see clearly that our sages are telling us that the very nature, the very attribute of longing and yearning is an elemental force in creation itself. And actually, we need look no further than the very beginning of the Genesis narrative, when we read in the first verse of chapter 2, when the heavens and earth are completed, we read the words in chapter 2, verse 1 of Genesis, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their hosts." And of course, this important paragraph, "Vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz v'chol tziva'am," and the heavens and the earth and all of their hosts were finished, forms the basis of the Kiddush, the sanctification over the wine with which we sanctify the Sabbath every week. But the Holy Or HaChaim HaKadosh explains to us that this is not so simple. These words, "Vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz," the word "vayechulu," which is derived from to finish. The heavens and the earth were finished. He tells us that this word, "vayechulu," and they were finished, is also related to another form of the same word, and this we read in Psalms 84. "For the conductor on the Gittis by the sons of Korach, a psalm, how beloved are your dwelling places, Hashem, Master of legions. My soul yearns, indeed it pines, for the courtyards of Hashem. My heart and my flesh pray fervently to the living God." And these words, "Nichsafa v'gam kalta nafshi," my soul yearns, indeed it pines. This word, kalta, means my soul pines. He says it's the same exactly as "Vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz." He says we can read these words not as "and the heavens and the earth were finished," but rather "and the heavens and the earth," as it's used in Psalms 84, "and the heavens and the earth pined." They pined for Hashem. And the great Or HaChaim HaKadosh, Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar, is explaining to us with his great knowledge of Kabbalah that the force of creation, the force of heaven and earth, indeed the very power of gravity, the force that binds creation together, is the sense of yearning, felt literally by the entire universe, to align, to unify, to connect to godliness. And so certainly this idea of yearning, of not having what you want, but knowing what you need, and maybe not even not knowing what you need, but knowing that you need something, it's godliness. It's the desire to bring the light of Hashem into the world and to be part of that light. That is the source of human yearning and longing, and the very power that sustains creation. So when we go back to the end of the Torah, to V'zot HaBracha, and we see the last letter of the Torah, the Lamed, which connects with the first letter of the Torah, the Bet, which spells Lev, which is of course the instrument and the vessel of longing. There's another factor as well, that Moshe Rabbeinu, after finishing his career, and through all of the tumultuous ups and downs of his relationship with his beloved people of Israel, and through all the warnings and the very stern words that he had for the future, should the children of Israel stray, he gives them the most beautiful blessing. And he tells them that under all circumstances, they will be redeemed. And he says, "Fortunate are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people delivered by Hashem? Am noshab Hashem, a people saved by Hashem, the shield of your help. Who is the sword of your grandeur? Your foes will try to deceive you, but you will trample their haughty ones. And these are literally the last words of the blessing that he gives to the people of Israel. And then he ascended from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the summit of the cliff that faces Jericho, and Hashem showed him the entire land. And there was one thing that Moshe wanted in this world, and only one thing. And that was what drove him, that desire. If such an attribute can be described, such a human attribute, if it can be described to Moshe, there was one thing and one thing alone that he needed, that he wanted, and that was to enter into the land of Israel. And the oral tradition is replete with incredible descriptions, and the pathos runs so high of Moshe begging and pleading and praying and cajoling under any circumstances to enter into the land of Israel. If not as a leader, as an ordinary person, if not alive, then at least dead, under any circumstances. And that was the one thing, for reasons known to the Almighty, that was not allowed to him. And so the Torah ends with a bang. The pathos, the yearning, which is so palpable that we can feel it, of Moshe Rabbeinu's being denied to come into the land of Israel. And yet there exists a beautiful tradition, our sages tell us, that in the future, at the time of the redemption, Moshe Rabbeinu will enter into the land of Israel, and he will bring that original generation into the land of Israel. So in a way, his yearning, which fueled his leadership and formed the backdrop of his relationship with the children of Israel, it just pours into the universal yearning as we roll the Torah to the beginning and we read Bereshit and we see Vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz, the heavens and the earth. We can read it literally pine for Hashem, and we understand that at the very core of existence is this very basic elemental need, this lacking, striving for completion, striving for the feeling of uniting with Hashem and bringing it together. And this is such an elemental factor of the creation of the world that the very water, oldest element that testifies to the unity of Hashem, about which the Torah doesn't even describe creation, but rather begins by telling us that the Spirit of Hashem hovered over the water, water being the witness of creation. The water was divided. And thus, when the water was divided, there was driven into the very heart of the world, like Rabbi Nachman's story, desire, longing, yearning. That yearning is the power of creation. It's a yearning for godliness. So having said all this, and taking this from the end of the Torah, and rolling the Torah to Bereshit, to the beginning, and finding the same theme, I ask you, what happened in Parshat Noach? What happened in a mere 10 generations from Adam HaRishon, from the first man, to the generation of Noach, that the world reverted, crept back into the mire, and forgot about God? The world became sunken in idolatry, in diversity and pluralism, instead of seeing the one, Hashem, ascribing greatness to so many different things that nothing mattered anymore except for each individual. How could that happen? And what was the element of justice and retribution? The very water. The very water which is the element of longing and yearning. The very water which was divided And when it was divided, which drove into the very heart of creation the universal need for godliness and for being together with Hashem and for unity, that water would now come to the generation of Noach and punish. What happened here? I believe that the world somehow strayed so far from Genesis 2, verse 1, that states that the heavens and the earth were literally pining for Hashem, and that could be felt, that reverberation could be felt by every human being. And I believe that the Torah teaches us a secret of where all of this started to unravel. I believe the Torah is giving us a hint that we can use in our everyday striving to serve Hashem and to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I believe there's a very great hint that we're given in the Torah, in Breshit, in the book of Breshit. Before we come to the generation of the flood, we read at the very end of chapter 4 in the book of Breshit, we read a mysterious verse. Doesn't get very much attention. It says, "And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then they began to call in the name of Hashem. Az huchal likro b'shem Hashem." And these words are translated in different Bibles, many different ways. Here's a very excellent translation based on rabbinical tradition. It says, "Then to call in the name of Hashem became profaned." But some just translate this as, "Then they began to pray to Hashem," or "Then they began to desecrate," or "Then they began to call in the name of Hashem at that time." That doesn't seem to be very earth-shattering, but the secret is that this word huchal, which has a connotation of beginning, is a play on words because it's also related to the word for profanity, for profane, for chulin, ordinary, irreverent, devoid of godliness. So what the verse is really telling us, as it's translated here, "Then to call in the name of Hashem became profaned," this is a signal to us about what's about to happen. The world is beginning to unravel. It's beginning to go downhill because calling to Hashem, praying to Hashem, bringing Hashem into the world, which is the goal of creation and the goal of existence, began to become ordinary, profane, regular. Irreverence began to become secular, self-serving, opportunistic, and cynical. And that was the beginning of the end. So mankind at that point had reached a great spiritual level, but it reached a level where it began to seek and achieve its own mastery, leaving God out of the picture. The generation of the flood, says the Midrash, said, "Who needs God? The only thing that we might need him for is a drop of water here or there, for rain, for our crops. But the world is so beautiful, it's got so much water in it. Look at all these lakes and rivers and oceans. We don't really need them at all." And God said, "If you don't need the water, I'll show you water." Water. Water is not only rain and water for food. It's God's benevolence. It's his blessing. It's our livelihood. It's our connection. And it's so elemental because it is the secret of purity, because it is the secret of yearning, because it was too divided. And since then, this has been the balance of man seeking to bring God into the world. And at that moment, when we read in this verse, Az huchal, in Genesis 4 and verse 26, at that point, mankind decided, no, we don't need to bring God into the picture anymore. And that was the beginning of the end. That was the beginning of the generation of Noach. And we can understand perfectly well the poetic justice the midah keneged midah, the measure for measure of Hashem's perfect justice as to why water was used to administer the punishment. You don't long for me? You don't long for me to be in the world? The secret of water, the divided water between the upper and the lower? You've begun to profane the name of Hashem? That will be your end. Because when we leave godliness out of the picture, when we begin to profane the name of Hashem, when everything becomes irreverent and ordinary and commonplace, when we divest ourselves of the divine image, when we no longer seek godliness in the world, then we no longer validate our existence, and there is no more purpose in creation. When we no longer yearn for Hashem, and the generation of the flood stopped yearning. And when we stop yearning for godliness, to connect ourselves to Hashem and to bring God into the world, then creation loses all meaning. That's the end.